So, on this special edition of World Traveler Cooking, we are going to make a simple white bread. This is something that I think every home cook should know how to make. It does take a little bit of effort and a little bit of practice. We're also going to be reusing dough instead of using new yeast every time. This will eventually lead to something more like a sourdough. If you haven't seen my ciabatta video yet, go see it. And I'm going to use a little bit of dough reused from that. The ingredients are really simple. Bread flour, and I make a kilogram at a time. You can cut this recipe down. But keep in mind you may have to play around with moisture just a little bit with the bread flour. Some dough from last time, and salt and water. That's all we're going to use. Now, before I start, it's worth understanding baker's percentages. Baker's percentages refer to the amount of an ingredient by weight in proportion to the flour. So, flour is your 100%. So, kilogram of flour, meaning if we're doing 70% hydration, which is what I'm going to do today, it will be 700 grams or milliliters of water, since 1 milliliter of water weighs 1 gram. And then I will use 2% on the salt, which will be 20 grams, and I'm not going to measure the yeast. Now I do 50% water, 50% flour on my preferment. That's a poolish, and then the rest of the water goes into the rest of the flour. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I have my reused dough here, and I'm going to add 300 grams of flour in here. There we go. And then I will add 300 milliliters or grams of water. So, tare it again. And 300 grams of water. Approximately. If you add a little more or a little less, it's not the end of the world. So, yeah. There we go. Now we will just stir this together. Before I mix that together, because it does have the yeast in it, I'm going to mix my water and flour for the autolyzed side. And I suspect it'll probably take basically all of this. But I want, what? That should be 700. So... That's 707, guess that's okay. And then we're going to add the rest of the water here, and this should be 400. So let's tare that again. A little over 400, I guess that'll do. And now I'm going to stir this together until I don't have any more dry flour. I don't need to knead it at this point. We're going to let this autolyze. I usually just mix all this together at once because it's easier to do all the math. Notice I haven't added any salt yet. The salt will get added in the next stage. So once this is relatively well mixed, typically I will then use my hands to just kind of pull it all together. And I'll just keep doing that for a while. But at this point, since I'm not going to use the spoon anymore, I am going to go ahead and just mix this together. And this should make a very, very, very thin dough, or a very thick batter, depending upon your preference for terms. And see how nice that is? Now, I'm just going to remove the spoon and let that go for about 8 hours. Back to our main flour batch. You'll note that this I haven't added any yeast medium to at all. Now you can just go ahead and add dry yeast to your poolish, to the pre-ferment, like you would in the ciabatta one. Okay, so now that this is done, I'm going to just go ahead and cover both of these, and we will be back in, well, since I'm using dough here, I'm going to give it 8 hours. But if I wasn't reusing dough, I might go ahead, if I was just using fresh or active dry yeast, I would probably just give it like 3 hours. So, see you in 8 hours. After the night, you can see the pre-ferment has become quite bubbly, and the dough here has become quite elastic. So my next step is I'm going to add 20 grams of yeast, and then I'm going to, salt. I'm going to add 20 grams of salt to this. I'm going to start to knead it a little bit. Wet hands really help. And then I'm going to mix in the this, but I'm going to save some for the next batch. So here's 20 grams of yeast. I've wetted my hands slightly, and then we're going to just knead this in a bit. Doesn't need to be completely kneaded in at this point because I have to knead the two together. Now we don't add the salt at the first because the salt will interfere with the gluten formation here, but we add it in here before we mix with our the yeast-bearing pre-ferment. Now, one thing to note is that as you knead bread, dough, it can become a lot more tough. So I'm just kind of squeezing it out here to form something that's a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to come back in about 10 minutes so that it becomes less tough to mix in the pre-ferment. Now I've gone ahead and stretched this again. Once you add the salt, sometimes a little water will come out, that's fine. But what we're going to do next is I've kind of stretched this into a little bit of a bowl. I'm going to save a little bit of my pre-ferment, and the rest I'm going to pour into that bowl. You save about as much of the pre-ferment as you started with. Save about the same amount each time. And then we just going to pour this in. Now, if you've used active dry yeast, you can have kneaded a little bit into the main the main dough here with the salt. If you're reusing dough or making a sourdough, you can't do that, obviously. So this can get a little messy, and I actually recommend after we move this we're going to put this in the refrigerator after we mix it for a few hours, and that'll let the yeast and salt and everything diffuse properly through the dough. Now, mixing this can be a little tricky because we have doughs with two different consistencies, but basically we're going to stretch and fold, stretch and fold, stretch and fold, and eventually what you're going to get is something where this is going to almost seem a little lumpy, as the additionally the pre-ferment is just going to stick to your hands. There's really not much you can do about that. If you're working with a poolish, that's just the way it's going to work. But eventually we're going to get to something where it's starting to get lumpy. And once it's lumpy, that means that your dough here is breaking up. And that's a good time to basically mix things together as best you can and then just set them in the refrigerator for a while. What's going to happen is if you cover it and set it in the refrigerator, water is going to rebalance, and it's going to take with it things like salt and yeast. But yeah, sometimes I just like grab it and mix it like this. Yeah, this is about as far as it's going to go. Alright, so this is now going to get set in the refrigerator for a couple of hours, and then we'll come back and we'll do some kneading. So after 2 hours, sorry. So after 2 hours, this has partly absorbed everything, but not all the way. So we are going to do another round of stretching and folding. And then we should have something which is reasonably incorporated. We're already starting to see bubbles develop in the dough. So this will be, so yeah, I think like one more time, yeah, this is enough. And then on the next rest, this will incorporate the rest of the way. So just knead it well, and then it will manage. After I'm done with this, it will go back in the refrigerator for another 2 hours, at which point I will likely divide it into loaves. I just like to do that rather than bulk ferment, but you can bulk ferment and divide later. That's just a personal choice. So here we are. So go back in for 2 more hours. Okay, so this will be the third and final kneading before I divide this. I'm going to show you coil folds, and it's really important to wet your hands so that the dough doesn't stick to it. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lift it up, and I'm going to coil it around. And this is really nice because it leaves the air bubbles largely intact. You get some degassing, but not a massive amount. So there you go. Next I'm going to divide this into 3 pieces and 3 different bowls that'll all go in the refrigerator for another hour or 2 before they go in the oven. So I cannot find my bench scraper, so I'm going to have to do without. I've decided I'm going to go ahead and get things started now. So with wet hands, I'm going to go run some coil folds. And I usually don't flour the surface on this next part. And the reason is, I actually want the dough to stick a bit. Once I have some basic coil folds done, I'm going to pick the dough up, make sure my hands are nice and wet. There we go. And I'm basically just going to stretch. I'm going to fold it down so that I can get something kind of like a ball. Then I'll place it on this, and I'm going to twist it around. Now, having it go into the refrigerator when it's kind of acidifying like this may lead to a little bit of a sticky dough. That's fine. But once we have that ready, we will just transfer it onto our baking paper. Okay, so now that it's like this, it's going to get set here for like 40 minutes, and then it'll go in the oven after I score it. I think this is going to be a great sourdough, so looking forward to it. So to get good oven spring, you need to score the loaf. To do this, we're going to get our knife completely wet. Some people like to use a razor blade. We're going to hold it pretty close to level, and we're going to cut the, we're going to cut the surface of the bread. And sometimes I will go across the cut a couple of times to try to make sure. Unfortunately, this is going back, so I might not get a good score. Oh well. So, next, this will go in the oven. I'm going to cover it like this for 25 minutes, and then I'll take that off. We probably won't get a lot of oven spring. It will probably come out kind of like this. So after 25 minutes, we have this is basically done steaming. As I noted before, it didn't score properly, but this does seem to have a decent amount of oven rise. So now this is going back in for another 25 minutes. So for comparison, I'm going to try scoring this one using a slicing motion with a wet knife and straight down. And I will just try across like that, and that's the new one coming out, so this will go right in, and we'll see how this behaves differently. So despite the bad scoring, this second one actually did spring a little more in the oven than the first one. Not quite sure why. You can see the score spread here, but I don't see anything similar. Yeah, there's the scoring spread here, but it's not as much. So let's go ahead and keep an eye on that. It may be that the off-center cut makes a big difference there. So I'm going to keep playing with this. If you have ideas on how to score bread, feel free to let me know in the comments. And so while we're waiting for that last one, I think I'm going to just go ahead and do the taste test. I'm going to take this still relatively warm. I think that's still a little too warm. I'm going to take this one that's been cooling off now for a couple hours, and I'm just going to open it up. You look inside, you have a nicely developed crumb, but it didn't rise that much. I suspect it will rise more as the culture matures, and we're basically making a sourdough here. So I'm just going to take 2 pieces and I will put them on a plate and spread butter on them, and we'll do a taste test. So this is the one we cross-scored. It really didn't come out any different from the others, so there is that. I guess I'll still experiment with scoring techniques and try varying the degree of water in the dough a little bit. At any rate, looking forward to trying this. And now for the taste test. Crunchy crust, meaty crumb, flavorful. This is where it's at. Really, really, really delicious bread. Now, if you find this content useful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you do things a little differently or you have some tips for me, I'm still working on figuring out both the specific moisture I want to use for this kind of bread and the scoring. You're welcome to give whatever tips you think. Note that I am using the refrigerator because of the climate. I'm here in the tropics, and it's ridiculously hard to get any decent dough strength when you're letting the dough rise at 35 degrees Celsius. So keep that in mind. If you have a colder climate, you may in fact want to just let it rise on the counter. I'll give some tips on that down below. As always, recipes in the description. Bon appetit, and see you next week.